Okay, everyone, let's look at how we can make UV maps in Blender. So I just have the default UV scene, or the default Blender project scene rather. Then I'm just going to add a subdivision surface just to turn this into an object that we can use to demonstrate how UV maps work. I'm going to subdivide this 4 times, then I'll apply, and then I'll shade smooth. All right, so the bulk of your UV editing is going to be in this dedicated workspace. So you just go to that UV editing workspace. Then by default, all right, you have this cross UV. So how UV maps work is they work based on the concept of nets in mathematics, like nets of 3D shapes in mathematics. Okay, so you know how you have a cube in mathematics and how the net unwraps to this. So however an object can unwrap to form a plane surface is what a UV map is, and that's what the principle of a UV map is formed around. So this is the default UV map for a cube. Remember, we subdivided this from a cube, but now I'll be showing you how you can make your own custom UV map. So it doesn't always need to be one shape. It can be separate shapes layered on top of each other or combined on one surface. Okay, so let's add a seam. How do I add a seam? I'm going to use either my vertex select or edge select. So let me use the edge select so it's a bit more clear. Then I will come here. All right, so you can see I'm looking at this line. I want to create my seam along this line. Then what I'm going to do, I'm going to press Alt A to deselect everything. And then I'm going to hold Alt. And then on the edge, I am going to hold my Alt and then I will right click. So that's going to select everything along this line, and this happens to be the middle line. All right, so I want a seam here. What is a seam? Let's say, for example, like spheres in mathematics, really, they don't have clear nets. So you have to cut up the shape in some way. So for spheres, cones, pyramids, you need to cut up the shape in some way to make the net. So it works the same way in UV mapping. And to do our cutting without destroying our object, what we'll do is we're going to press Ctrl E and then we're going to click Mark Seam. So therefore, what it will do, as you can predict possibly, is this part is going to form its own UV and this part is also going to have its own UV. All right, so let me make another seam so I can have 4 parts, just one here. The same way I held Alt and then with my right click on this line, and that selects the entire edge loop. These are called edge loops, by the way, when you can select them at once. They're called edge loops. So I'm going to mark another seam there with Ctrl E and Mark Seam. Now, how do I unwrap? I am going to come back to my vertex select and then I'm going to press A to select everything. Yes, I still have this UV map, but no, I do not want this UV map as my object has changed shape. So I'm going to press U and then I am going to select from either of the options. So we're going to look at all 3, though most of the time I recommend you using this one. So yes, angle based. Here is conformal. At times they're similar, but there's a difference. And then here is minimum stretch. So for this tutorial, we'll be using angle based. All right, we'll get into the nitty-gritty of each method later on in some other video, but for now I just wanted to introduce you to the basics of UV unwrapping. So effectively we have our UV map. We can further control how this looks by packing islands. So I'm going to come to the UV menu and then I am going to pack islands. Now I have 2 options here, scale and rotate. What do we want to achieve when we pack islands? We want to pack islands so that our UV islands cover the UV workspace better. So let's introduce ourselves to some terminology. This is your bounding box. These are islands. Then you also have selection modes here. Your regular vertex selection mode, edge select mode, and face select mode. Then you also have an island select mode, which you do not have here. So that's unique to UV. So I can select this. Then with my G, I can move it around. I can select this with my island select, G to move around, G to move around, and G to move around again. So as you can see, this one bled out a bit. This bounding box isn't like a prison for your UV islands, but think of it as that way most of the time. You can only logically spill out of this box when you want to achieve what's called tiling. All right, so let me quickly load in a tileable textures to properly demonstrate how that works. All right, so to display the tiling, let's make a new object. What can we tile? Generally, we tile flat surfaces. or surfaces with flat UVs. Take for example planes. I'm going to use Shift A to add a plane. All right, then I'm going to make its own material so I can use it to load the tile texture. So I'm going to call this one tile. And then I am going to add my tile image. And then I am going to connect it to its base color. So when I come to the UV editing tab with the plane selected, I'm going to temporarily hide my cube. And then I change my viewport to material preview. I can see the tile, and mind you, this is a plane's UV because it's just one face. It's one face covering the entire bounding box. But when I scale it like this, watch, when I press S to scale with all vertices selected or the island selected, you can see that there's a repetition. So it's only for instances like this that your UV map should leave the bounding box. Every other instance, your UV should be within the bounding box. All right, so let's come back to our cube. So I'm going to select my cube, then press edit mode to bring me back to UV editing. Based on what we've just discovered, having this island bleed out won't do us any good. So let's bring it back in. Then now let's go back to our packing island. So I'm going to select all my islands with A. Then I am going to pack islands. To pack islands means to arrange them in a way that they cover the bounding box as best as possible without any space, because generally to get the most out of your textures, you want your UV maps to cover the most space possible without stretching them irrespective of the individual axes. So you can scale an island, right, with S. So you can scale an island with S, but as you probably can guess, this one is going to get a better texture output than these other ones. So when you scale, you generally want to use the individual origins option when scaling islands. So how did I get here? I pressed the period key, the one next to the slash key on your keyboard. So I pressed the period key, and then I'm going to change this to individual origins so that when I'm scaling, I scale them all at the same time. So don't do a modification on one island without doing it to the other. You can, depending on what you want. If, take for example, you don't mind neglecting a certain part of your object, but generally it's advised that your UV islands be modified similarly. So that's what pack islands will do for us. So I'm going to undo the scaling we just did. Pack islands is going to scale and rotate the best as it possibly can so that it covers the most space within the UV bounding box. So I'm going to go to UV, and then I am going to go to pack islands. Now we have two options here. We have the scale option, which is similar to what we just demonstrated. Then the rotate option, let's look at it again. All right, so we've scaled everything again, but let's say I want this one to really fit and I don't want to scale it down. I could also rotate it and then move it here. All right, so that's something we can do. I'm just undoing my steps. So the rotate, it's not all the time that you will need it, because at times it might rotate your islands in a way that your textures won't fit accordingly. So at times I do recommend unchecking the rotate, but the scale is generally what you want. So, but in our own instance, just for demonstrative purposes, I'm going to leave the two of them checked. Then the margin. So this margin generally is very small. I tend to bump mine up to 0.1, and the margin is the space between islands, the max space between islands. When it's on 0.01, that's almost effectively zero. So they're going to touch each other very well, and you don't want them touching too much. You just want there to be enough space between them, but not too much space. So 0.1 I found is enough. And then we're going to pack our islands. And you can see they cover up almost the entirety of the bounding box now. Just this little space here that we shouldn't be too pressed about. And that is how to make UV maps essentially. So just you unwrap and then you pack your islands basically. But let's also look at how we can restore our seams when our object doesn't have seams but it has a UV island. So to clear the seams in the first place, you're going to press Ctrl plus E, and then we're going to clear the seam. All right, so that worked to clear the seam. Okay, let's see what will happen when we select everything and then we try to mark the seam. So you can see everything has turned into a seam, and let's temporarily unwrap this. You'll see how messy it is. Exactly. So let's undo that and let's undo making everything a seam. So how do I get my seams to take the shape of these islands when my seams are not present on my object? Because here's what happens. You're going to export this probably as an FBX or an OBJ to use in some other program, and then you're going to re-import it at some point probably. But when you do re-import it, it's not going to have those seams because seams are program dependent. So how do I reconfigure my seams, you might ask? I am going to use A to select all parts of my mesh. Either select mode is fine, but we're using the island select mode now. Then I'm going to come to UV, and then I'm going to come to seams from islands. And my seams are back. So have that in mind when you've exported something with seams and now you want to re-import it, but you don't know how to get your seams back. Now, what else can we use seams for besides opening up our object for unwrapping? Well, as I said earlier, you can also layer UV islands on top of each other, but when you do, generally you want the islands to have different materials. So let's come to our material window. You can see the entire object is using one material, but let's say I want this one to use one material, this another material, and then all 4 parts, 4 different materials. So how do I go about that? Look at this. All right, so I am in face select mode. I am going to hover over the part I want to assign to a new material, and then I'm going to press L. All right, then I will plus sign new. I am going to call this one material underscore B. Let's rename this one to material underscore A. Then I will assign. And just so we can tell the difference between the 2 materials and what's assigned to the other and what's not assigned to the other, I am going to change the viewport display color of material B. But since we're in material preview mode, it's not going to work properly. So that will only work when we're in solid mode. All right, so you can see the part we assigned to material B has changed color in the viewport display mode. So let's say I want to give this one its old material as well. I am going to come new material C and assign. Then I'll also change the viewport display color so we can tell that what we're doing is correct. And then with my L again, hover over the part I want. L plus sign new material underscore D, and then we'll assign and change the viewport display color. So we have 4 materials on the object now, but remember, as I stated earlier, typically you want your UV islands to cover the bounding box as best as they can. So all I need to do now is, with just this portion selected, since it's all assigned to material B, I'm going to press U, and then I'll unwrap it again with the angle-based method. And since it's just one island, it doesn't have a more square shape. This is the best it can get. So all I need to do now is maybe move it to the middle with G and X. So I'm going to press G first, then X to move it along the X axis to bring it to the middle. All right. Then I'll do the same for the other parts. Unwrap angle-based G, then X. Unwrap angle-based G, then X. Unwrap angle-based G, then X. So when you press G, it moves free range. But when you restrict it to just the x-axis, it moves side to side, and then on the y, up and down. And because this is a 2D view, there isn't a z-axis, okay? So if you try GZ, it's just going to move round and around. Now, you might also wonder, is there a way to restrict my movement to just within the bounding box? To restrict your movement of islands, we will come to the UV menu, and then we're going to click constrain to image bounds. So now when I try to move it outside the image bounds, it doesn't move out. So let's try with the other island. Exactly. And that is it for this tutorial, just to show how UV unwrapping works and how you can easily assign different parts of your mesh to different materials with their own UV islands. Thank you for watching. Be sure to leave a like if you found this helpful, and I'll see you in the next tutorial.